Hello, I'm Michael, and if you're here, it's because you're as attracted to fear as I am. In a small colonial town in the heart of Mexico, known for its cobblestone alleys and old mansions, Valeria, a young 29-year-old writer, arrives to finish her book. The Airbnb she chose is a house of classic Spanish architecture with weathered stone walls and windows that whisper stories of a distant past. Valeria was coming from a series of creative blocks. The calm environment and the promise of peaceful days were just what I needed. Upon entering the house, the smell of aged wood and the decoration with local crafts enchanted her. However, there was something she couldn't ignore, a feeling of being watched. As he was organizing his things, he noticed a small note left on the table. Please respect the house rules. Common rules such as no smoking, keeping quiet after 10 p.m. and not opening the basement were listed. It was curious how the basement was highlighted with several capital letters, but she didn't pay much attention. That night, as I wrote, the city seemed asleep. The silence was interrupted only by distant footsteps and the sounds of creaking doors coming from the house. Valeria, trying to ignore the restlessness, thought they were natural sounds from an old house. But something about these noises didn't seem right. In the days that followed, Valeria tried to focus on her writing, but something in the house seemed disturbing. During the mornings, the atmosphere was calm, almost welcoming, but as the sun set, the atmosphere changed. The air seemed heavier, and inexplicable sounds echoed through the corridors. Small noises, like shuffling footsteps and creaking doors, began to repeat themselves every night. In an attempt to shake off her restlessness, Valeria explored the city during the day. The colonial architecture and vibrant markets distracted her, but the feeling of being watched persisted. Whenever he thought about the house, a chill ran down his spine. During one of her walks, she noticed how residents avoided talking about the region where she was staying. Furtive glances and discreet murmurs reinforced that something was wrong. On the third night, as he was reviewing his notes, a muffled sound interrupted his concentration. It seemed to be coming from downstairs, like heavy breathing or something dragging across the floor. For a few seconds, Valeria remained motionless, trying to distinguish whether the sound was real or a figment of her imagination. When he decided to investigate, his heart was beating wildly, each step on the wooden floor echoing in the silence of the house. When he reached the ground floor, he noticed something that made his breath stop. The basement door, which had been locked since his arrival, was ajar. The air coming from there was thick and cold, filled with a damp, metallic smell. She watched the opening for a few seconds, feeling a growing weight in her chest before rushing to close it. As he touched the doorknob, he noticed marks in the dust, large, defined fingerprints that weren't his. Valeria used the key she found on the entrance table to lock the door again. For the rest of the night, the sound of footsteps seemed to slowly ascend the stairs, but she remained motionless, clutching a knife that she had placed next to the bed. In the following days, the situation worsened. Objects began to move around, lights flickered for no apparent reason, and the environment became oppressive. The feeling that something was lurking made it impossible to ignore the events. She tried to contact the host of the house, but his response was evasive and disconcerting, as if he was more concerned with keeping secrets than helping her. The invisible presence seemed to gain strength. Valeria's fear grew with each passing night, and she knew something in the house was beyond her understanding. The following morning, something changed drastically. Valeria woke up in the middle of the night, her heart beating wildly. The familiar sound of footsteps was louder, closer, almost as if someone was walking next to her bed. She looked at the clock. It was 3:30 in the morning. The room was colder than ever, and she could see her breath forming clouds in the air. With paralyzing fear, she stood up, the knife still in her hands, but an inexplicable force pushed her towards the cellar door. It was as if something was guiding her, forcing her to go there like a puppet. Her hands shook as she reached the door, which now seemed less of a barrier and more of a promise of something unknown. When she opened it, a cold wind enveloped her, making her bones ache. The darkness inside the basement seemed to swallow everything around it, but there was something else, a sound, distant but present, like a whisper, coming from the back of the room. The sight in front of him was disconcerting. She almost couldn't believe her eyes. In the center of the cellar, there was a circle of unlit candles and a dark stain on the floor, something like a trace of something ancient and sinister. The feeling of being watched increased unbearably. The air was thick, charged with an energy she couldn't understand. An invisible force was pulling her feet into the basement, and, as she tried to move away, Valeria heard a muffled scream, as if someone had whispered her name directly into her ear. She took a step back, feeling her mind spinning. At that moment, she realized something even more disturbing. The house was alive. The sound of footsteps did not come from outside, nor from anyone else. It was from the house itself, as if the house was moving, breathing, waiting for the right moment to reveal its secrets. Desperate, Valeria ran upstairs. The ground seemed to shake beneath her feet, and as she climbed the stairs, a feeling of claustrophobia enveloped her. The walls seemed to close in, and the shadows, once harmless, now stretched out like arms waiting to grab her. When she entered her room, the air was colder than ever, and the lights flickered, leaving her in dim light. What she didn't know was that by opening the basement door, she had released something that was now inside the house, with her. Valeria could barely think clearly. Fear, once a distant shadow, was now a palpable presence surrounding her on all sides. What she had unearthed in the basement was not something that could be explained or understood with human logic. It was something much older, deeper, that had been kept there, hidden in the bowels of the house. At the same time, she knew she couldn't just give in to it. Something inside her resisted, fought against the growing feeling of impotence. She locked herself in her room, shaking and sweating, but she knew she couldn't stay there indefinitely. The house was alive, and I wasn't about to let it go. The walls, once so solemn, now seemed to pulse, as if they were waiting for something. An answer, perhaps, or a new victim. Valeria's mind began to reason in a state of increasing despair. She tried to remember everything she had learned over the years about the supernatural, but nothing seemed to make sense. The rules the host had left behind, with an emphasis on the basement, were starting to have more meaning. She understood that the house was not just a place of rest, but a place of confinement. Something had been locked there, something no one should release. As difficult as it was, she knew she needed to face it. The only way to get over what was happening was to confront what was happening. Without thinking twice, she went down to the basement again. The fear that dominated her was paralyzing, but an internal force drove her, as if it were the only way to survive. Each step taken was an effort, a fight against his own mind, against the screams that echoed in his head. When he entered the basement, the energy in the room had changed. The air was thicker, charged with a dark foreboding. The unlit candles were now lit, and a figure, a dark shadow, appeared at the bottom of the space. She wasn't human. It was a manifestation of what had been released, something that should never have left its confinement. But Valeria had no choice. She stared at that entity, her sweaty hands gripping the knife tightly, knowing she couldn't let it take control. She forced herself to step forward, determined to confront the entity. I didn't know how, but I knew I needed to do it. As the air became colder and thicker, a feeling of relief began to settle within her. She was taking control, facing her greatest fears. I knew the battle wasn't won yet, but somehow I was closer to understanding it. Fear still enveloped her, but she would not let herself be dominated. Something inside her awakened, a survival instinct, a strength that she had not realized until then. The house might be alive, but it was also capable of fighting. The tension that hung in the air was unbearable. Valeria felt the weight of the entity's presence, as if the house itself was looking at her. The darkness seemed to move, undulating as if it were a living thing. The cold had become a biting ice, penetrating to the bone. She knew there was no going back. Whatever was trapped in that basement, she had freed. And now the house demanded something in return. The shadow in front of him seemed to form more clearly, gaining contours, but still without a defined shape. It was a presence, a being of pure evil that fed on fear, pain, and loneliness. Valeria's eyes began to fill with tears due to fear, but she didn't allow herself to give in. The knife blade in her hand shook, but she knew it was her only defense. Suddenly, the house shook, the walls creaked, as if they were being compressed by an invisible force. The feeling that the earth beneath his feet was about to split open increased. The sound of the candles going out was the first sign that something even more dangerous was coming. Then, without warning, the entire basement was enveloped in a deep, dense darkness, heavier than any moonless night Valeria had ever experienced. She could barely breathe, and the heat that once enveloped her was now replaced by a deadly cold. The entity approached. Her steps were heavy and muffled, but somewhere inside Valeria, something woke up. She realized that the only way to defeat the creature was not to confront it directly, but to control the environment, manipulate the energy in the house. She didn't know how to do this, but her intuition guided her to an old book she found on the coffee table in the basement. The pages, aged and worn, were covered with symbols she could barely understand. But there was something there, something that aligned with the rules the host had left. With shaking hands, Valeria opened the book and began to recite the words written there, without understanding the meaning, but with the feeling that this was her only chance. The house groaned. The ground shook even more, and the entity, which until then seemed invulnerable, began to retreat, as if it were being repelled by an invisible force. The air became even colder, but at the same time, Valeria felt an energy taking over her. She was in control now. The entity took a step back, as if it were being pulled away, but Valeria didn't stop. She continued to recite the words, louder, more firmly. The house began to react violently. The doors slammed, the windows shook, and the light flickered. It was as if the structure itself was fighting against her. But at the height of the chaos, there was a sudden silence. The sound of the entity disappeared. Valeria looked around, her heart beating in her chest. The shadow was disappearing, being sucked deeper into the house, into whatever its original prison was. She felt the energy dissipate. The air warmed again, and the heaviness in the room began to ease. But as she looked back, she noticed something that made her freeze. The basement door was open, and at the top of the stairs, a silhouette was watching her. It wasn't human. It was nothing she had seen before. It was something even darker. And before he could react, a voice whispered directly into his mind, "You can't run away." The house finally calmed down, but the feeling of terror still hung in the air. Valeria couldn't move. Her feet were rooted to the ground. The silhouette at the top of the stairs watched her with eyes that seemed to not belong to reality. She felt a malevolent presence, stronger than ever, as if the entity was just waiting for the right moment to rise again. The shadow in front of him was no longer hidden. It was an amorphous form, a dark mass of energy that seemed to expand, trying to swallow whatever light was left in the house. Valeria's heart was beating out of control. She knew there was no escape. The house, now more than ever, seemed alive, a prison without walls. She looked at the basement door, and her mind tried to process what had just happened. The battle against the entity was not over. What she had freed was not something that could be defeated with a simple spell or words written in an ancient book. It was something that had resided there for a long time, and now she was part of that plot, condemned to live the experience until the end. She tried to move, but the words whispered in her mind seemed to arrest her actions. "You can't run away." Valeria felt a sharp pain, as if her soul was being pulled deep into the house, into eternal darkness. She looked around, trying to find a solution, but the only way out was the same basement door, now open, like an invitation. The air was thick, heavy, as if the house itself was trying to swallow her. Every step he took seemed to be towards his own destruction. Valeria realized that there was no longer any escape. She was already in line with what the house wanted. It was a cycle she couldn't break. His fight, his resistance, had been in vain. The entity, which was still watching her from above, began to move again. It was as if she had found her new purpose, herself. Valeria didn't know what would happen now. The house had swallowed her story, and there were no more words, nor magic that could save someone already so deeply rooted in that place. The ending was decided. The house closed behind her, and in the end, the only sound left was silence. The kind of silence that comes after terror, when everything left behind is an echo of something that can no longer be changed.